So because I was asked, I'm going to give my 2 cents on the Twilight vampires versus Vampire Diaries vampires, who would win in a fight debate. We've talked about this before, but the Twilight vampires have this reputation of being like silly and campy and not scary because they sparkle, which is understandable, but as written, they're horrifying and they're essentially indestructible. We're dealing with 2 wildly different beasts here, and I gotta say, I think it's gonna be the Twilight vampire every time. The TVD vampires are much more human in every sense, and that makes them much more appealing and fun to a lot of people, but it also makes them inherently more vulnerable. Importantly, these vampires have weaknesses. The Twilight vampires essentially have none. These vampires can bleed. They can be weakened by wood and vervain. They can be staked, take off their daylight ring, and they'll burn in the sun. None of that applies to a Twilight vampire. None of it. And I think it really just comes down to their physical composition. The Twilight vampires are literally like rocks. If you think about just the physical structure of a TVD vampire, yes, they're going to be stronger than a human, and yes, they heal fast. But a TVD vampire can be staked by a human. Imagine trying to do that to a Twilight vampire. You can't even like penetrate their skin. You can shoot at a TVD vampire with wooden bullets and it'll hurt and weaken them. If you did that to a Twilight vampire, it'd be like throwing jelly beans. They don't even bleed, they crack, and this takes a lot of strength to even achieve this, and usually more than one vampire. The only way you can unalive this vampire is by ripping them apart and burning the pieces, because they can reattach themselves. 1-to-1, would an average TVD vampire be able to do this? I don't know. Yes, we see the TVD vampires rip each other apart, but they're made of much softer stuff. They would need to be exceptionally strong to do any kind of damage to this vampire. I think the only one who would maybe have a chance would be an original, the oldest and therefore the strongest, maybe Klaus. But here's the thing, yes, it's very difficult to unalive an original in their world, but if one of them got a hold of the white oak stake, I think he's done. And to be honest, they probably would, even if we're just talking about the Cullens. They have a mind reader and a psychic among them. And that's the other thing, a lot of the Twilight vampires have special gifts that give them advantages. The Cullens are self-righteous, pretentious, and embarrassing, but they're not physically weak at all. I think even Klaus would need a team of supernaturals for it to even be a fair fight. And like 1-to-1, Edward versus Edward in a different font, Glitterbag's gonna rip that rip hell right up, sorry to say.